Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really curious to hear about your story. So perhaps we could start from the start. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about where you were born and raised.
Yes. So I was born and raised in England. I was born into Scientology, and I spent the first 30 years of my life, birth to escape, as it would be best be termed, working in Scientology. My mother, as a single mother, joined what's called the Sea Organization when I was 4 years old. That's sea as in like ocean. And Sea Organization was founded by the founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, in the late 60s as a means of actually avoiding government detection and oversight. They could be at sea and move anywhere they wanted to. But members of the Sea Organization sign a billion-year contract. It's a paramilitary organization whose members commit their lives to really indentured servitude to the management and operations of Scientology. So as you can imagine, when my mother joined as a single mother with me at the age of 4, for all intents and purposes, my life began as an orphan at that point because I was turned over to Scientology staff members to raise me completely. And from that point forward, nothing about my life would parallel what you would expect for a child.
Do you have memories of being 4 years old and your mom joining?
I do. Actually, one of my very earliest memories was around the age of 2 or 3. Essentially, at the time of my birth, both of my parents were already in Scientology. My mother got into Scientology at the age of 17. My father, who I've never known, was also in Scientology. And so when I was around the age of 2 or 3 years old, they divorced. And I've come to learn since that this was because of Scientology. My father wanted nothing more to do with Scientology and moved away from it. And as a result of that, that was my first experience with Scientology's practice of disconnection, where you are required to completely cut off any and all contact, as if the person has literally died. And so my first experience with Scientology's practice of disconnection was at the age of approximately 2 years old when I lost my father. And I distinctly remember having the feeling that it was my fault.
Wow. So did your mom ever tell you what led her to join Scientology and how was she approached in the first place?
Yes, she did. The way that my mother explained it, her older brother, who she was closest to, she was one of 7 children. And so her next older brother had gotten into Scientology through some friends of his. This was, 70s in England, hippie culture. And my mother and all of her siblings had been raised very strict Roman Catholic. And so she was somewhat rebelling against this. She'd been, trying LSD and various other rebellious type activities. And like I said, her older brother, my uncle, had gotten into Scientology and he got her in as well. In my experience, Scientology preys on people at their most vulnerable points in life. So anyone who has gotten into Scientology in their late teens or as an adult, that happened because they were intentionally preyed on at a very difficult time in their lives. So in the case of my mother, as a 17-year-old, she'd gotten pregnant out of wedlock, which of course for a Roman Catholic is, tantamount. I wasn't raised Roman Catholic, but I understand that, the way my mother explained it to me, my grandmother very much made her get married when she was 8 months pregnant with me to my father because she couldn't have a daughter have a child out of wedlock. And so from that point forward, my mother launched very, very thoroughly into the insane world of Scientology. And, for me, of course, this was a hand I was dealt at birth. As a child growing up in Scientology, no one ever asks you, hey, do you want to be a part of this cult? It's just not part of it's not an option. You're in and there's no consenting. It's just the hand you're dealt.
It's very interesting that you tell me she was 17, she was slightly preyed on. They sensed that she was vulnerable. It reminds me of when I was 18 years old, I had just started studying psychology, and I was walking down the street in Dublin, and some Scientologists approached me and they said, "Oh, would you like to do a personality test?" And I just started studying psychology. So I was like, yeah, I mean, sounds interesting. And I went up to their office, and it was a very long process. Like, there was this very long personality test. And then after the test, they told me about myself. But interestingly enough, nothing resonated. And I would have been extremely vulnerable at this point in my life. But they wanted to sell me books. They were sort of like, okay, we have books for you. We've got 2 books. You can give a donation. And I remember I had so little money because, I kind of needed to hold on to whatever money I had. It was expensive studying in Dublin. And I was like, well, I don't want to give these people my money, so I'm just going to be on my way. And, they didn't manage to convince me to, kind of stick with Scientology or get into Scientology. But it could have worked. If there'd been no, like, give us some money, and if it had been a bit more accurate what they were telling me about myself, I was definitely at that age of, like, I needed some help, I needed some guidance, I needed to feel like I fit in. So I'm just thinking of your mom, and she was far more vulnerable than I was. I had a university course to start, whereas your mom was a single mother, and she was dealing with the shame of the Catholic Church, and I guess transmitted through her mother, who perhaps was experiencing that shame because of her upbringing and the control the Catholic Church used to have on people. So I'm imagining this must have seemed like it was going to be the thing that would save her, and she was going to be supported by this fantastic community, perhaps.
Completely. Yeah. And I think very often that is how cults lure people in. There's a presentation of an acceptance, a community that will surround you and love you and support you. And that has appeal, especially at that moment in a person's life when they're vulnerable and perhaps they don't have support of family or friends, or they feel isolated. Certainly I can see 100% that was the case for her. And that's where, even though, I was in Scientology for 30 years, I've been exposing Scientology now for 19 years. I lost my mother the moment I left. The moment I escaped, they chased me. Anyway, that's a whole other story. But, she cut me off instantly. And still, I don't blame her. I just choose it to say, you know what, this is motivation for me to educate people on what this is, because it's dangerous and people need to be aware. And I think that more and more, especially with the internet and access to stories and people like you exposing and helping to tell people stories of cult survival, it's helping a lot of people to recognize cults for what they are, as well as how they lure people in, because it can happen to anybody. It's not just, like, in my case, I've been asked so many times since I've left Scientology, well, you seem like a normal person. It's like, yeah, this is the only life I ever wanted, was away from Scientology.
I think you make a really good point there, because I think people could be perhaps suspicious if it comes with the label of Scientology, but if there isn't a label that people are aware of, that people could easily end up in a community that is actually a cult that they're only recognizing as, a loving, kind community. So I think that's a really, really good point. So you were 4 years old and other people got involved in your caregiving at this point. So could you tell me what that was like? Who was involved in raising you? What were things like?
Yep, absolutely. The best description I've come up with of my childhood from that point forward, so that now we're talking age 4 to age 10, pretty much centered at St. Hill, which is a property located in the south of England in East Grinstead, West Sussex. So I was put into what's called the cadet organization. Cadets is what they call children who they are training and grooming to become members of the Sea organization to carry out 1 billion years. The best description I've come up with of this experience that I'm about to explain is orphanage meets Lord of the Flies meets Nazi youth. That's the best combination of elements. And why I say that is because From the moment I entered the cadet organization, if I saw my mother 2 hours a week, that was a good week.
Wow.
Yeah, I was put into, there was maybe, it varied in terms of number of children, but easily there was 40 to 50 other children varying in age from 6 weeks old to 16. And so we would go to the local school in a village in England called West Hoathly. We would get bused there. And that was going to local school was about the only normal piece of our childhood. And I loved it as a result. But we lived in dorms. So it was communal birthing at large properties that they had that were owned by Scientology. So there was a girls' dorm and a boys' dorm. And anytime that we weren't in school, we were required to be either studying Scientology. Again, this was, in my case, from the age of 5 is when I started first studying Scientology. And then also doing manual labor tasks. And we were made into groups. So, for example, when I was 7, I was responsible for about 6 or 7 other children my age, and I had to, run them. So we had checklists of all the things that we had to get done. We were required to keep statistics, which is all of this is Hubbard policy and teachings as to how an organization has to be run. We were cogs in this Scientology organization, again, from, the age of 5 years old. So this was my life as I knew it. And because I went to local school, I started to realize that I was in a very different situation, of course, than my friends in class who their mom dropped them off at school and they, she packed their lunch for them and they could have play dates. Anyway, I think you get the idea, but it was a very foreign situation in terms of a childhood and upbringing.
Did you get picked on or bullied at school for being different?
Of course. Yeah. We would get called Sino. That was the word, like there'd be Sino. And I remember talking to my mom and because of course I didn't understand. And I said, why are we being called names? And she said, oh, that's because the way she put it was, there's squirrels locally. Squirrel is a term in Scientology for someone who has left Scientology and is now doing an altered version. That's not the approved version. It's just, like thinking back on it now as a mother myself, the conversations I had with my mom were insane.
So there was an explanation for the bullying, and that it was
all because it was bad people. Bad people were attacking Scientology, which is a good thing, and it's just something that you live with. And ironically, she would always tell me, which, that's not this next part is not from Scientology, but she would always say, sticks and stones can break your bones, but words can never hurt you. And I was like, okay. As a child, that didn't make me feel better in the moment.
Yeah. So that tells me that you were experiencing a lot of emotional pain and that you were questioning, like, why do I have to put up with this? Like, this doesn't really make sense. And that you were looking towards your mom for explanations or for help to alleviate some of that distress.
Yeah. And honestly, that was a secondary problem to just my constant struggle to try to have attention and be able to spend time with my mother. It was just always, that was the primary battle of my childhood. So for example, when I was around 7 years old, my mother got in a lot of trouble. Within this organization, there's very strict rules about any kind of interactions, male and female. So for example, there's no sex out of wedlock allowed. And again, she was single. So she had started a relationship with another member of the C organization and had relations with him, for which she was then very severely punished. And she was sent to what's called the Rehabilitation Project Force. And that's their reprogramming attempt. So in that program, people within that program are not allowed to talk to anyone not in that program. So for approximately 6 months, she was on that program, and I was not allowed to talk to her at all. She was the Rehabilitation Project Forces. They dress all in black. They live separate to everybody else. They do heavy manual labor for the whole day, except for 5 hours. And during the 5 hours, they're doing Hubbard's counseling to find their alleged evil purposes. That's what that program is.
And she was kept far away from her boyfriend during this.
Oh, yes. Yeah. They never ended up, their relationship did not survive that punishment, which I think was probably the intention.
Yeah. And you couldn't interact with your mom during this. Would you see your mom from a distance during this time, or?
No, she was at an entirely different location. In fact, she was, at the time they had a massive construction project at St. Hill, and her heavy labor was working on that construction site. And she ended up getting hit in the head with a brick and getting rushed to hospital. And when she was brought back from that, they taught me, again, I was 7, maybe 8 years old. I think I was 7. They taught me how to do Scientology, what they call touch assists, which is literally used to go, feel my finger, feel my finger, feel my finger on somebody's entire body. They taught me how to do that to nurse my own mother back to health after she'd been hit in the head and had a concussion.
So what is this, feel my finger, and you do it over the person's entire body?
Yep, it's called a touch assist. So Hubbard developed. He made up several different procedures, and there's various different forms of this, but they're called assists. And the intention, the claim is that it will help somebody recover from any kind of physical, wound or illness, or so anytime somebody has an injury or an illness in Scientology, they do these assists on them. So the one that I was trained to do is a touch assist.
Right. And then you would do that for hours.
Yeah, until she felt better. You do it over and over and over again until the person says, oh, I feel better now. And then that's it for that one. And then you do another one in an hour or two. So it could run for 5 minutes, or it could run for an hour.
How did you feel when you were doing that? Did you believe it? Did you believe it was working?
So I was made to study it always as a child. I never had pause to evaluate and even think about, honestly, acceptance. So I did what I was told. And that's, it was never an option to say, well, I don't believe in this. I don't believe this works. That just was never a part of the language. It was, this is the way, always. So, the way I've explained it in retrospect is the moment Scientology became my own choice was when I left, when I was 30 years old. And at that point, I had the space of mind to just decide that this was not my choice.
Curious about the various different forms of abuse that you experienced when you were in Scientology. So I'm thinking of the whole range: emotional, physical, sexual. How much abuse did you experience?
A lot. In the cadet organization as a child, there was rampant sexual assault, not by adults in my case, but older children. Because again, we were 40 to 50 kids with maybe 1 or 2 adults, and we were supposed to take care of ourselves for all intents and purposes. So when you have that type of a situation, there's the extreme lack of supervision makes that just a part of your childhood, unfortunately. And sadly, in Scientology, Hubbard has what's called an emotional tone scale. And so it goes from minus 40.0 up to 0, which is 0 is body death. And then up to 40.0, which is now you're surviving and you're doing well. It's called serenity of beingness. My point being that just above 0, body death, there's a tone level, it's called, of victim. In Scientology, the concept of victim is 100% negative. You're a bad person if you're being a victim. You're pulling it in is the terminology, the language used in Scientology, which means simply that if something bad happens to you, it's because you yourself did something bad. Therefore, you deserved it. It's called overt motivator sequence. And so I again, this is just part of the language I was raised with. And within the cadet organization, especially, if you reported something bad happening, then you were going to be blamed for it. And I've only very recently, I've been in therapy and working on how to recover, which is what prompted me to reach out to you, by the way, because I saw your talk with Claire Ashman on cult survival. Yeah. And it just really struck me, it's a path. It really is. And whatever somebody's recovery path might look like, talking about it and helping other people to know that there's hope is really, really important to me personally. Anyhow, but so all of that to say that I really only very recently was even able to say out loud what happened to me as a child, because I knew that if I did as a child, it would be blamed on me. And I think in my heart, or just even as a child, the protection mechanism, I knew that would destroy me as a person.
Yeah, it's really crazy, their ability to make you feel like you're not being strong. If you're bringing your feelings, your dissatisfaction, your unhappiness about situations, if you bring it to them, then you're being an inconvenience. You're not dealing with it in the way that you should, and that being a victim is not the right approach. So therefore, you then experience something that you are extremely affected by, and then you have to take on this approach of, oh, what did I do to make that happen, and how do I suck it up and not be the victim? So then they don't get troubled with any emotions from anyone. You just try to survive in this environment.
Right. And I never told my mother, again, because then I'd be blamed for distracting her from the important work she was doing. Yeah, there was another time that in terms of physical situations. So again, like I mentioned, I was living in a girls' dorm, and there was a night that I fell out of a bunk bed and landed on some planks that had been left on the floor. And so I cut open my head and broke my collarbone. And the next day, even though I was in excruciating pain, I demanded to go to school anyway, because like I said, school was the only normal piece of my childhood, and I loved school. So I went to school anyway, but of course with a broken collarbone and blood on my skull, the teacher very quickly saw that all was not well. And so at lunchtime, I was called in to see the headmistress. And the headmistress was just like, what happened? And it didn't occur to me, honestly, until about 30 years later, that her line of questioning, she 100% thought I'd been abused. Well, of course, it was neglect, and everything else. But even at that age, again, I think I was 7 or 8 years old when I broke my collarbone. Even then, I was already so well trained to not say one negative thing about Scientology. And I knew that I would get in a lot of trouble if I did.
Wow. So even a teacher who is suspicious actually feels like they can't really intervene, or you're convincing enough, so they're not going to intervene.
Right.
Did you manage to make friends at school, or was your belief system so different from your average child that you were just completely alienated from being able to form any friendships?
That's a great question. I tried to, but yeah, even the language that I knew and that I grew up with, like I couldn't differentiate between English language versus Scientology. And so it was very isolating. So for example, as a child growing up in Scientology, they would say, don't be banky. Banky is in reference to what Hubbard calls the reactive bank, or the reactive mind, which is, as in his belief, the source of all negative pain, emotion. That's where you store engrams, which is moments of pain and unconsciousness. And again, this is a very complicated explanation for something that I grew up with as a child. Like, don't be banky means it's, in today's world, it'd be like, hey, stop acting out. Or, what do normal parents tell their children when they're just throwing a fit? We would get told, don't be banky. Right. So things like that, or like, don't cut my comm, don't cut my communication. Again, communication's it's like everything, it's layer upon layer of things baked into Scientology. And that's the language that I was raised with, before even learning English, so that was my first language, unfortunately. And so because of my inability to differentiate as a child, I tried to have friendships with people outside of Scientology, but we were kind of a science project to them. Like, again, we were bussed in. My mom didn't spend time with me. So if I wanted to go over to my friend's house, for example, it was a complete ordeal to try and see if I could get approval to do that. And most oftentimes I'd be denied that.
Yeah. So you were trained to suppress your emotions. There was no one in your community whatsoever who was going to validate your emotions. Do you remember what that was like and what problems it caused for you? Because you were keeping all of your entire emotional world inside. I'm just curious about what you think the consequences of having to do that were.
Oh, yeah. Great question and great observation, by the way. That's something I'm still working on to this day. I've essentially what it caused is this bottling up of anything that I ran into in life. And I've had some really challenging experiences later as an adult in Scientology. And then after leaving, and it made it like I was a volcano, and it would just like blah, 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 and then erupt. And the emotion with that eruption was really shocking, honestly, because then I felt like I was failing. It felt like a failure, even though it's not. It's okay. One of the first times that I was talking to a therapist was after my husband and I got out of Scientology. We actually filed a lawsuit against them for labor law violations, forced termination of pregnancy, a lot of other things. And during that lawsuit, we went through several grueling days of deposition with some of their top staff members. And it was the first time when, in retrospect, I realized that they were using the programming and language that I'd grown up with to undermine and try to make me fold. And so one day I was driving my kids to school and I was just bawling my eyes out. And at that moment I was like, okay, I'm going to go talk to a therapist. Of course, I was raised to believe that all psychologists and psychiatrists, no offense to you, you're a wonderful person, but that you're all evil and bent on destroying humankind. And, that's just what I was raised to believe. So to even consider going to a psychologist, I think it illustrates the breaking point that I'd reached. And when I was talking to the therapist, she was like, well, what happened? And I was like, well, I don't want my kids to see me crying. And she said, well, why not? I'm like, well, because that means I'm upset and that's going to hurt them. And she's like, you know what? It's okay to model emotions and you can have a bad day and it's okay. It's not the end of the world. It was shocking.
Yeah. I'm thinking of like emotional breakdown in my mind. And the reason I'm thinking of emotional breakdown is when people are forced to compress all feelings, they hold it together fantastically for a very, very long time. And then you said like volcano, I think you said the word volcano, like the explosion of emotion, but there's so much trauma kept inside. And when you take the cap off and it starts to come out, it's like an emotional breakdown. Not that that's necessarily the right term to use, because that's, it's not a diagnostic label or anything, but it's like someone can feel like they're breaking down because there's just so much coming out, and then someone feels like they're not coping, and it's very, very distressing. So I'm curious about your experience of releasing emotion to the point it felt like an emotional breakdown.
Yes. And I did come to realize and do better with realizing that even though that there was that explosion, that explosion was caused by bottling it in, not because I was actually losing the battle, so to speak, but I just realized it had become this habit almost like when you work out, you make your muscles stronger. Well, emotionally, I had made my muscles of coping and holding it in way, way stronger than they ever ought to be, to be able to survive, and to be able to present as how I was supposed to present as a child, like everything's wonderful and I'm happy and, life is great. And it was far from great. There was nothing great about it. I was, the little voice in the back of my head as a child would always, I loved to read, and I would always just hold out hope for that, fairy tale happy ending that someone would swoosh in and rescue me. Never happened, but that's okay. I'm here now. So it just took a little longer than I would have liked. But yeah, no, it definitely, I started to realize that actually I was hurting myself by holding those emotions in and not letting it out and not asking for help and not being able to do, the normal coping mechanisms that help us deal with emotional challenges in life.
It must have felt very unsafe when you were alleviating that distress, because there wasn't anyone necessarily there to be like, it's okay, just release these emotions. So was it scary for you when you started to experience all of these emotions that were...
Absolutely. And so later on, so I was in Scientology's C organization from age 16 until age 30. I worked at their headquarters, which is this super isolated 500-acre compound in Riverside County, California, surrounded by barbed wire fence, security guards, you name it. My parents, even though they were in Scientology and still are to this day, at least my mom and my stepdad, they were not even allowed to know physically where I worked. And this compound is where I met, and very shortly after married, my current husband, Mark Headley. We're a statistical anomaly, miraculous that we're still managed to survive through all that, get out, and we have an amazing family now. And actually, we're coming up on our 32nd anniversary. But my point of bringing this up is that we married. I was 17, he was 19, and for the first 13 years of our marriage at this property and in Scientology's C organization, we could not even talk to each other openly. Like, we were never allowed to even discuss, first of all, having children, because that was a crime. No children are allowed there, or even the thought of wanting to get out. That's a suppressive act, is what they call it. And if I said to my husband, let's get out of here, I don't want to be here anymore, that's a suppressive act. And when they found out about it through regular interrogations that they do, then Mark and I would be separated and not allowed to talk and not allowed to interact until I recanted and said that I only said that because of crimes I committed, quote unquote. Again, it's all layer upon layer of programming, but the point being, I couldn't even have an open conversation with my own husband.
So you met Mark when you were 17, and then you were dating in the community of Scientology, but sharing your true thoughts and feelings was completely impossible.
Yes, couldn't really call it dating. I mean, they're just, because we were working from 8 a.m. until midnight every day. We weren't allowed to leave the property. So, but yes, we agreed that we liked each other. And then shortly thereafter, we got married.
Sounds a very difficult place to be picking your lifelong partner. What was it about Mark that made you feel, actually, this is someone that you feel safe to partner with, and that you can trust him? And at 17, you were very young, but how did you decide that you wanted to be with Mark?
Funnily enough, again, a great question. I could see that he was more of a rebel underneath it all. And so I very much always thought that he was stronger than me. We had very different upbringings. And in fact, Mark didn't even know that I had been in the cadet organization as a child until after we left, because I never talked about it. But I saw that he just did not. Whereas for me, compliance to their orders and doing what I was told and everything was 100% mandatory. It's how I was raised. It's how I survived. It was never a choice. And I just saw that though he was very good and he was at the headquarters and it's not that he was a a bad boy, but I just saw that he was much more questioning of things than I was. And I saw that as strength.
It's very interesting because under the conditions of survival, and I'm not sure if were you consciously feeling like you were surviving, or was it so normal that you didn't even register as like, how do I survive in this situation? But it's very interesting because I think most 17-year-olds who grow up without loving caregivers end up picking very poor partners for themselves. I find it fascinating that as a 17-year-old, even though you were not given caregiving that was loving and supportive and that prepped you to pick a very good partner for yourself, you're in this situation and you perhaps unconsciously pick someone who would actually increase your chances of survival.
Yeah, that is very interesting. But yeah, it was definitely unconscious. That's been part of my path. My own path to recovery has been, I've just kind of mentally gone, I will read anything, I will listen to anybody, but I will only accept things that make sense to me and that help me in some way. And so organized religion is completely off the table for me at the moment, probably honestly for the rest of my life, to be completely fair. I'll read anything, but I've had to kind of hold space for myself to go, how do you move forward from this? It's really, really hard. And especially having had so many layers of programming from such a young age, that kind of muddling through that and thinking, well, like in any situation, am I thinking this because of programming? Have I unraveled all of that now? Like how to, when it's so deep from such a young age, I think it's very, very challenging to be self-aware enough to go like, okay, how do I do this?
When did you start to challenge whether life in Scientology was a good one? And when did you start to think about, is this really all okay and acceptable?
Yeah. So funnily enough, I never dared to consider life outside Scientology when I was in. But I used to have nightmares and dreams about trying to get out all the time. And even those, I wouldn't tell anybody that I was having these nightmares, literally about physically trying to break out, because I thought that they would assume that they would put the same label on me, like, oh, that means you're planning to leave, and that means you're a criminal, and that means you've done bad things. But of course, I knew I was miserable. At the headquarters, I personally witnessed David Miscavige, the leader of Scientology, physically abuse staff hundreds, if not thousands of times. Emotionally, physically, I saw all manner of abuse and very, very awful situations. And also, I saw many people trying to escape. Some of them succeeded, some of them didn't, unfortunately. But through all of that, I knew I definitely was miserable. Like I'd gotten to the point towards when I escaped in 2005, where I had suffered extreme weight loss. I wasn't sleeping. I was just nauseated 24/7. And then at the beginning of January 2005, my husband, Mark, escaped without me. And so all of a sudden I was left there. He tried to talk to me. Anyway, it's a story that's very well covered in a book written by my husband, Blown for Good, Behind the Iron Curtain of Scientology. I'd love to send you a copy if you have any interest in reading it.
Before Mark escaped, he tried to talk to you about it?
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about how he tried to communicate that, bearing in mind there wasn't much privacy to communicate things?
Yeah, so all that happened is he radioed. So we had these organization phone radio. They weren't ours personally, but we both had one of those. So he radioed me and asked me if I was going to come home. Well, I'd been working around the clock, and I told him I'm going to try and come home maybe for an hour. Anyway, so he never said anything outright that he was planning to escape. But that was as much as we talked. It wasn't like I had no idea what was going on with him. He was in trouble for something else, and which was, again, it's covered in his book. But long story short, he'd been told that he was going to be sent to the rehabilitation project force in Los Angeles the next day, which meant he would never see me again anyway. So he decided he was out. And so he had a motorcycle and he took off, but security saw him right away. They chased him. They ran him off the road. There's a police report of that incident that's pretty shocking too. The police called for backup because they felt threatened by security. That was the communication between us was, are you coming home and can we talk? It was not like, by the way, I'm heading out. Do you want to come? And, honestly, in retrospect, even had I gone home, because of the depth of my programming, I can't honestly say that I wouldn't have panicked and ratted him out. If we had had that conversation, I just don't know what my response would have been, just honestly.
Because you were programmed to rat on people, that actually it could have happened, that you might have felt the best thing for you to do is to tell the organization that.
Right. And the odds were so high. Like, I knew if I tried to escape that I would never speak to my mom again. I'd never speak to my siblings, all my friends. Like, my whole life had been so deeply entrenched in Scientology that to consider on the spot losing all of that in a flash, I don't know. I can't say honestly that I wouldn't have freaked out.
Yeah. And there was, before Mark left, he didn't have any connections on the outside.
No, none at all. And even I knew that, so I had mentioned my uncle, my mother's older brother. He's actually still in the Sea organization in England, and not as a huge side story, but he escaped, and my mother ratted him out and had him brought back. And this was like 5 years before I was now in a position where I wanted to escape. In other words, I knew that my mother would in an instant just send me back, So that makes it very, very difficult to even consider getting out. You know that they're going to chase after you and you know you have nowhere to go. For all intents and purposes, you're trapped. So it can feel very, very overwhelming to even consider that there might be a possibility of life outside that world.
So Mark is gone, and what happens next for you? At what point do you decide, okay, this is what you want to do as well?
Immediately, I was like, I was initially just shocked and devastated and like, wow, what is happening? But in my mind, the house of cards quickly tumbled. And within 24 hours, I realized and really acknowledged for the first time how actually miserable I was, and that I had no relationship with my mother, honestly, since I was 4 years old. The moment she stepped in that billion-year contract door, if you will, I'd never, from that moment forward, any love from my family was entirely conditional and dependent upon my cooperation with and in Scientology, that's not real life, So, and also in that moment when Mark was no longer there, it just struck me like I love this man. He's my husband. And no matter what anyone tells me, he's not a bad person. Of course, Scientology were immediately saying he's suppressive and he's gone to the dark side and he called the police. That means he's gone to the dark side. He's a bad person now because Scientologists are not allowed to call the police. So all of that. And I just kind of mentally, like the block came down and I stopped receiving input. And then it took me 3 weeks to figure out how to escape. And I did that. Again, I was in California. I figured out a way it was very difficult, very challenging, but I figured out a way to contact Mark unbeknownst to anybody and
figure out how to contact him.
Right, because he was gone. Oh, sorry, you said, how did I figure out how to contact him? So my sister at the time was a college student. So she was not in the same, she didn't work she wasn't in the Sea organization. She was just what we would call a civilian Scientologist living in Los Angeles. And I had an email address for Mark that was not an organization email. It was a Hotmail account. And so I devised this idea. I could get him a message by sending him an email, but I had no email access, no internet access at that property. So I called my sister and I made up this whole story about how Mark was on a special project because I was not allowed to tell my family even that he had escaped. So she sent him an email asking him to call me at 6 o'clock the next morning, which he did. And so I was taking risks again because he was calling me on an organization phone. They had access to the records, but I was hoping that I was playing along well enough that I wasn't completely under a magnifying glass just yet. So he called me and we devised a plan that I was going to go to an eye doctor appointment and get a cab from the eye doctor appointment and then get out, because getting off that property was the only chance I had in the physical condition I was in to avoid detection and confrontation in my attempt to escape. Unfortunately, I went to the eye doctor appointment, got the cab, but I made a mistake and turned my phone back on. I panicked in a moment, and they ended up tracking where I was heading. So again, I was escaping from California. By the time I made it to Las Vegas, Nevada, I was on a Greyhound bus. They had sent 4 people to intercept me at the Greyhound bus station in Las Vegas. And so I literally had to just sit on the floor of the bus station on my purse. And, I honestly, in that moment, I don't know if I said it out loud or just thought it, but I was like, if you touch me, I'm going to scream. And because I didn't know if they would drag me out of there. They have done that to people. And I just hoped that in this foreign world that I was in, where I knew nobody, and now here I was being intercepted by 4 staff, including a 6-foot man who could very easily overpower me, that if they tried that, somebody might call 911.
Wow. So you're just sitting there on the floor, you have 4 people around you, and you're prepared to start screaming if you need to in order to be taken.
Yes. And they called Mark and told him that they'd caught me, that I wasn't coming, and they threatened to follow me. I had to change buses, which is how I ended up in the bus station. So they threatened to follow me on the next bus. And I just, I don't know. I think in that moment, by my entire upbringing, I should have failed. But somehow, we find fortitude in unusual places sometimes in our moments of need. And I certainly did in that moment. I'm so grateful because obviously I wouldn't be here today had I not. But so I got on the next bus. They didn't follow me, thank goodness. And a day later, I was reunited with Mark, and the rest is history.
What did it feel like when you were reunited with him?
Oh, my goodness. It was such a feeling of, emotional relief and exhilaration and freedom. So completely and safety as well. Yeah, it was quite something, quite the journey, that's for sure. And, I'd always wanted children. And so now we have 3 boys. My oldest son just graduated high school last week. And so, it was in that moment of reuniting with Mark, it was truly the first day of the rest of my life.
How old were you when you got out?
I was 30.
So from the age of 17 to 30, you'd never had a private conversation with your husband. What was it like to have your first conversation with Mark and be able to share all your thoughts and feelings for the first time?
That's a great question. It was hard still. It was because the programming was so deep that it took a while to unravel all of that. And, and so I was pretty angry with him for leaving me behind. And what does this mean? Why did you do this? Was this about our relationship? And of course we quickly got through that. That was lesser than the feeling of relief of reuniting with him for both of us. And of course, but there was a lot of talking through what had happened and our experiences. And that kind of really, Mark and I have laughed about it. It's almost like we've had 2 marriages, one in and the one that started when we got out. Mm. And the second one being the real one, I guess. It's not that the first one wasn't real. It was just not on our terms. So, you can't really consider that like you said, we couldn't have an open conversation about pretty much anything. We knew we had a connection, and we leaned into that. And we are a statistical anomaly. Most relationships do not survive that, unfortunately. But, never, it's just one day at a time.
Did you worry that people from the organization would try and find you?
Very definitely. And they did. So starting in 2006, Mark started posting on the internet, just saying some of the experiences we'd had. And very quickly, we became prominent targets of Scientology. Like right now, if you Google my name, you'll see that they have a hate website about Mark and I that has videos of our family that look like POW videos of them saying, we're just telling lies about us. And it's sad. It's really sad, because I think to anyone in the outside world seeing this kind of behavior from a alleged religion with tax exempt dollars that they're using, and that's what they're using those dollars for, it's pretty shocking. And it really says more about Scientology than it does about me personally. But yes, we've absolutely been targets of Scientology's practice of fair game, which is that, in the words of L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology will attempt to destroy, silence utterly, tell lies about any of their critics, anyone who whistleblows about their experiences in Scientology, anyone who advocates for the victims of Scientology. So, we've that's the life we've lived since getting out of Scientology.
What was the worst that got in relation to feeling threatened, feeling like you were under threat by Scientology after you left?
Well, that's a good question. So there was a time, I have two answers to that. Number one is when my sons were 2 and about 3 months old, we were living in California, and Child Protective Services showed up at our door, and they said they'd received an anonymous complaint, and that by law, they were required to look into it and come visit us. And they said they'd looked into it, and that it was very definitely a bogus complaint, but that we needed to watch our backs. Mm-hmm. And quite honestly, I still was so fearful at this point. This was 2008. I had not personally spoken out against Scientology. Mm-hmm. And at that moment, with this man who came to our house from Child Protective Services, and he's telling us we have to be careful, I had no question in my mind, not even for 1 second, that this was Scientology. And at that point, it was a moment of reckoning for me, because I realized if I didn't step up and start exposing the truth, then I was going to be setting an example for my kids that bullies can get away with it. And that was not something I was ever going to do. And as terrifying as it was in that moment, I knew it was the right thing to do. And so really, that was the beginning of my path. The second instance was around that same time. I can't remember if it was before or afterwards, but my husband, Mark, had been invited to Germany to speak at a symposium of e-delegates by an official in Germany, Ursula Caberta, who has done incredible work exposing the dangers of Scientology throughout Europe. And Ursula had invited Mark to speak at this symposium. So Mark was out of the country. I was home alone with my 2 young boys. It was a Sunday morning, and there's banging at the door. And I opened the door, and there's a man there with a briefcase. And he said, "I've been sent here by Scientology to ask about your husband's involvement with Anonymous." I was like, "What?" And he repeated himself. I've been sent here by Scientology. And I slammed the door in his face, and I was just like, what is going on? And I called 911. And that was the first time I'd ever called 911, actually. And I was just absolutely besides myself. And it was so unexpected. And so like, who does that? I'm a 32-year-old woman home alone with 2 kids. They know full well my husband is out of the country, and they send somebody at 8:00 in the morning to try and have a confrontation with me and get me alone. It was just so creepy. And I swore to myself from that moment forward, I would never be caught off guard ever again.
Mm. With having 2 young children and child protection arrive to investigate things, lots of women would be so scared of losing their children that it would silence them. But for you, it led you to want to fight against Scientology, to prove to show your boys that actually people can't bully you in that way.
Yeah.
In that way.
Yeah. And I think that comes from so many years of myself being silenced as a kid, and just that absolute, like, I'm not going to have this for my kids. I'm not going to put them through what I went through. And so it had the opposite effect, thankfully, but you're right, but never for one moment, honestly, did I consider. I was literally, I have that moment frozen in my head, closing that door and just being like, that's it. I agree to silence. No more. This is the end. And I do not, as terrifying as it was to even consider speaking out in that moment, I had no question for 1 second that it was what I had to do.
So you took out lawsuits against Scientology. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes. So we filed these in 2009, and Scientology kind of banks on the fact that it's going to take so long for someone to recover when they get out that any statute of limitations will have run its course. So we ended up filing our lawsuit a week before the statute of limitations would run out. And we had several courses of action: forced labor law violations, human trafficking, forced termination of pregnancies, several different causes of action. And it was a 4-year battle, and ultimately we lost. But in the final judgment, the judge made the statement that had we pursued other causes of action, such as assault and battery, false imprisonment, we may have fared differently. And it was very much a David and Goliath type situation. We just had one lawyer. We were up against several multi-million-dollar law firms fighting us on this lawsuit. And it was very, very hard, very, very, for me personally, it was the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation of really facing and learning who Scientology actually are from a very different perspective for the first time in my life, and just recognizing the evil of it and the control and the leverage and how they actually were attempting to destroy us. Anyway, so in the end, like I said, we lost. We were required to pay their legal fees, which was $43,000 approximately. We didn't know this, but our lawyers reached out to the Scientology lawyers and said, hey, my client will just go away and agree not to take any further action if you waive this bill. Scientology came back and said, we'll only waive the bill if your client signs over the rights to Mark's book, Blown for Good, Behind the Iron Curtain of Scientology, agrees to never speak publicly about Scientology ever again, and turns over any and all communication they've had with any media and any former Scientologist. So basically, they wanted us to turn into rats. And we were like, no. We sold a van. We scrambled to pay that money. And then unbelievably, a friend of ours was like, you should do a fundraiser. And we did a fundraiser. And that was one of the most incredible experiences in all of this, because within 2 weeks, from people all over the entire world, we had fundraised that money back. It was so moving to just, go like, wow, this is crazy. And so as hard as it was, I wasn't silenced. Here I am today again. It's been quite the journey.
It's such a fascinating story, because when you take legal action against an organ like that, the best thing that can happen is justice, and that someone is sitting there saying, yes, you were completely wronged. And then they have so much money to fight against your case that actually you end up then having with this bill. And I think it sounds like the justice that was done was actually you had all these people donate and be on your side and be like, no, here you go. You deserve this. You've been through enough. So I guess instead of you winning the lawsuit against them, that actually the justice was that you felt that lots of people were on your side, because I'm sure it was a huge amount of people came together to donate for you to be able to have that money. It must weight off your shoulders when that bill was
Yes, especially I was pregnant at the time with my youngest son. We had 7 and 5-year-old sons already. So it was huge. And it was just this, it was such a contrast to so many years of feeling completely isolated and alone in Scientology. To then have this experience was completely opposite to that and gave me hope to go, no, people see what's happening here and it's the right thing to do. And it just continues to motivate me to do hard things in exposing Scientology, but that it is the right thing to do. And people do need to know that this is a dangerous organization and that they present falsely and they try to lure vulnerable people in, and that should not be possible in today's world.
You fought really hard against Scientology. Do you feel that now you're in a position where you can be left alone, or that anything that does happen, you feel strong enough to be able to defend yourself against?
I will never presume to underestimate them. So even, for example, when my husband wrote his book and we released that, we wrote wills. I was 34 and he was 36. And I just said, I support you in this, but at the same token, we cannot underestimate who these people are and what they're capable of. So it will always be a difficult road. I don't think it necessarily gets easier. It's just that we get more experienced with what they're capable of and are in tune to it. But even the other day, I was thinking about that. I was like, gosh, will I ever not be looking over my shoulder to see if a private investigator is following me? I can't honestly say I know the answer to that question.
Yeah. What's your life purpose based on everything that you've been through? What has this led you to want to work on? And I guess because it's an incredible journey and it's remarkable that you got out, particularly because you were brainwashed into this way of living from such a young age. Has this led you to develop a life purpose that is, I guess, helping others who might be in a similar situation?
Absolutely. So I'm currently serving as the president of the Aftermath Foundation. It's a nonprofit foundation formed in the U.S. that helps people get out of Scientology and start new lives. That brings me incredible joy to just help people get out. And of course, I know what that journey is like, having escaped with $200 in my pocket and just the hope of reuniting with my husband. No high school education, no resume, no family connections, no car, all of that. So helping people to get out, I taught a 44-year-old woman to drive a couple of years ago. She'd been in for 27 years, helping people reunite with their families and give them hope to start over is absolutely something that brings me great joy. And then second to that is my personal hope and goal would be that at some point I might contribute to making it illegal to involve children in cults. I'm writing a book currently about my whole childhood, and I just want to continue educating people on what it's really like, because I've been asked so many times, why didn't you leave sooner? Or questions of that nature that just indicate a lack of understanding of the impact it has on a child actually to grow up in a cult. With this level of programming and lack of family connection and lack of any normalcy that you'd expect a childhood to represent. So, I would just like to continue educating people on that topic because I think it's very, very important.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you still feel you're on the road to your own recovery in relation to dealing with everything that you've been through. I can only imagine the level of trauma, because it was not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 incidents. It was daily. You were under these circumstances. Of course, some situations probably far more horrific than others. Where are you at with your healing? And do you still have times when you have a lot of anxiety as a result of what you've been through?
Yes. So I have a wonderful therapist who's been very, very helpful. Originally I was kind of like leaning into therapy only as a Band-Aid type handling. And last year I had an amazing conversation with a therapist, and I'd kind of hit one of those explosions where I felt like I was losing the battle. And she pointed out to me, she's like, you've got to be willing to work through this and not run away and she said, honestly, if you can't stick at it, I think you're going to do more harm than good. And that really was really eye-opening to me, to just realize that, there's just a lot to work through. And I've read so many books. I read or listen to audiobooks all the time. So I've been trying to better educate myself on what I've been through and just hear different perspectives and hear other people's stories. And so it's been a path, but I'm absolutely continuing to do the work for myself, because I think I owe that to myself to not throw in the towel on me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such an empowering story, because sadly, most people who are born into this in the way that you are will never be able to get the strength, opportunity, insight to be able to recognize that they will benefit from leaving. And it's even more surprising that you managed to do it with your husband and that the two of you remain together. Such an extraordinary story, Claire.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This has been a very enlightening conversation. Your observations and questions have been amazing.
Where can people find out more information about you?
We have a website, which is blownforgood.com. Blown is the word in Scientology for an unauthorized departure, thus the name. So blownforgood.com. We have a YouTube channel. Mark's book is on the website. And yeah, lots more to come. We're going to keep doing the work.
Thank you so much, Claire. We'll put all of that in the description below. I really appreciate you taking the time.